Hi everyone, now I answer the question of the day of death.
Mini story for Day of the Dead. In the mini story, I will do three things. I will make a statement. For example, I arrived in Guatemala. When you hear a statement, a sentence, you just say, ah, or oh. Okay? You need to say that, show that you understand this is not a question. Okay? A statement is not a question. So, when you hear a statement, say, ah. For example, I arrive in Guatemala. Ah. Okay? The second thing I will do is ask a question you know the answer to. For example, where do I arrive? Okay. I will stop. You say the answer. Okay. You must say the answer to every question. I say, I arrive in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
I arrived in Guatemala.
You say, Guatemala. Okay, easy. And number 3, I might ask a question you don't know the answer to. If you don't know the answer, just guess. Say any answer, but you must answer every question. Use your pause button if necessary. Okay, let's begin. Okay, here we go. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala?
Families arrived in Guatemala.
On the Day of the Dead. Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November?
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala.
3rd? No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive?
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
In Guatemala. November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive?
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
On November 1st. Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I didn't hungry about this holiday.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I didn't sad about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
I'm curious about this holiday.
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
I was curious about this holiday.
The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
I'm curious about the Day of the Dead.
Which holiday was I curious about? The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead?
Yes, I'm curious about the Day of the Dead.
Or was I curious about Christmas?
No, I wasn't curious about Christmas.
No, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
I went to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery?
Yes, I went to both the cemeteries.
Or did I go to the airport? Easy.
I went to the cemeteries.
Yeah, I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
I went to the cemeteries.
Well, me, right, AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
I went to the cemeteries.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
I go to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery? Well, to see.
I go to the cemetery to see what's happening.
See what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
I went to the cemetery to see what's happening.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery? In Guatemala.
The cemetery in the watermelon.
The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead? A holiday.
The Day of the Dead was this holiday.
The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead is November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring? No, it
was boring.
wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it was interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
The I felt the cemetery was interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
Interesting. It's quiet. The quiet was interesting.
The cemetery. The cemetery
The cemetery was interesting.
was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting? It was interesting on the day.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Of the dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party.
The atmosphere was like a party. Was like a party.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, I wasn't atmosphere sad.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
The atmosphere was happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party?
The atmosphere was like a party.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
The atmosphere in cemeteries was like a party.
In the cemetery. Right? The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, the atmosphere wasn't like a party in my house.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
The families sitting
Around the graves. Right? They were sitting
around the graves.
Around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families were sitting around the graves.
The families, right? The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, they wasn't sitting around the trees.
No, they weren't sitting around the trees. They were sitting around the graves. So, where were they sitting?
They were sitting around the graves.
Around the graves. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes, they were sitting around the graves of their ancestors.
Yes, they were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No, they wasn't sitting around the graves of friends.
No, not really. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
Family was sitting around the graves of the dead ancestors. Thank you for listening.